When people think about the term colonization, they often think about something that took place a long, long time ago, and they often fail to acknowledge and understand that there is in fact a dark, enduring legacy of colonization that continues to negatively impact the lives of Indigenous peoples. In order to understand this link, we must first look at what colonization is. In Mary Ellen Kelm's 1998 Colonizing Bodies, she defines colonization as a process that includes geographic incursion, sociocultural dislocation, the establishment of external political control and economic dispossession, the provision of low-level social services, and ultimately the creation of ideological formulations around race and skin color that position the colonizer at a higher evolution than the colonized. So what does that mean, and what does that even look like? Well, according to scholar Yin Paradies, historically it looked like war, displacement, forced labor, removal of children, relocation, ecological destruction, massacres, genocide, slavery, unintentional or intentionally spread of deadly diseases, the banning of indigenous languages, the regulation of marriages, and the eradication of social, cultural, and spiritual practices. Believe it or not, some or all of these forms of colonization were experienced by Indigenous peoples. From a contemporary perspective, it is important to understand the link between the devastating forces of colonization and the current socioeconomic status or well-being of Indigenous people today. In other words, it's important to understand that the forces of colonization and the enduring legacy of this destructive process has resulted in a general poor quality of life. Don't believe what you're hearing? In 2009, the United Nations stated, Indigenous peoples continue to suffer discrimination, marginalization, extreme poverty, and conflict. Some are being dispossessed of their traditional lands as their livelihoods are being undermined. Meanwhile, their belief systems, cultures, languages, and ways of life continue to be threatened, and sometimes even by extinction. Take Canada as an example. In virtually every measurable area of well-being, Canada's Indigenous population lags far behind other non-Indigenous counterparts. From 2010 to 2012, the Assembly of First Nations produced a series of quick fact sheets that highlighted the poor quality of life and well-being, along with the socioeconomic discrepancy that exists between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in our country. They state that 37% of on-reserve homes require major repairs. 34% of First Nations communities still get water by truck, from wells, or collect water from a lake or a river or a water plant. That 32% have unsafe drinking water. That 23% of First Nations people live in overcrowded homes. That 10% do not have electricity. Further, that 1 in 4 children live in poverty. That suicide rates are 5 to 7 times the national average. That First Nations life expectancy is 5 to 7 years less compared to non-Aboriginals. That nearly 50% of Aboriginal people today have not completed high school. And finally, today, an on-reserve First Nations youth is more likely to end up in jail than to graduate high school. These are alarming statistics that confirm that colonization certainly has an enduring negative impact on Indigenous people in this country. Understanding the link between colonization and the current status of Indigenous people is so important, because all too often non-Indigenous people, or more appropriately contemporary settlers, claim that colonization was a historical event that took place a long, long time ago, as I'd previously mentioned. Further, most settlers would agree that the process of colonization is no longer tolerated, let alone exists in our country in the 21st century. However, several scholars, including Adam Barker, assert that Canadian society remains driven by the logic of imperialism and engages in concerted colonial action against Indigenous peoples. The fact that Indigenous people in our country remain the least prosperous demographic group is a testament to the enduring legacy of colonization. For this reason, we cannot simply get over it. We must first understand and acknowledge the link between colonization and the current poor quality of health and well-being in order to move on and move forward together and to reconcile together.